listening to Tony Graham on Binjang 91.5, and now it's time for the Mayoral Report after the council meeting, the full council meeting that is, last night. And in the studio too, we have the Mayor of Dubbo Regional Council, Mathew Dickerson, and the Deputy Mayor of the council and Wellington representative, Richard Ivey. And good day to you both.
Hey, g'day Tony, good to be chatting to you again.
Yeah.
Morning, Tony.
Well, you had a good morning, didn't you? Because you're at the opening at the Malian Art Cultural Centre.
Yeah.
There was an art exhibition there. It was hosted by Dennis Holding and Orana Arts.
Well, he's the actual artist, Dennis Holding, and
Yes.
I'd encourage people to go along and have a look at it. And this is the plan that council has for that space. We've got there at Cameron Park, the cafe, the art exhibition area, the cultural area, and we've leased that to the Lands Council for $1 a year, which some people said obviously that's a very cheap lease, and I'd love to be able to lease the building anywhere for $1 a year, but we really want to do that from a council perspective to encourage things to happen there in that space, and today is a perfect example of that. The opening of the exhibition by Dennis Holding called ID Hero. Saturday morning at 11 o'clock he's doing a talk, an extended talk about the artworks that are there, and it's obviously open for people to come along and have a look at it. So it's a really good space and a really good use of that space. I hope we'll see a lot more exhibitions there.
Yeah. And Richard, you would know that over the years, this is one of the things that Wellington townspeople have wanted. There's been surveys done in the past that pointed to that, and now we're here by the looks of it.
Yes,
finally.
Indeed. Yes, indeed. I mean, Wellington really has got a fantastic backbone, if you like, of Indigenous artists. There are some very talented artists in Wellington, both from everything from making a lot of woodwork to dot paintings to engraving, and really they need somewhere where they can actually show their wares and really encourage the public to become more involved in their work. And I think this is a first step towards making that happen.
And it's a great thing to see this as a vehicle for more integration into the community.
Oh, absolutely. And it was really good down there today at the opening. Really, there was a very good representation from across the community, not just amongst the Indigenous people, but the broader community. And there's a real sense of, I think, of camaraderie, and let's try to make this work, let's together make this work.
Yes. Matthew, did you get the vibe from that too, did you?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you want to take a bit of that back to Dubbo if you could?
We'll take a bit of that back and,
yes.
and see how we can share that between Dubbo and Wellington as well. But no, it was a good event there, but again, this is number one. This is the first exhibition that they've actually held there.
Yeah.
We hope to see a lot more there. Now, we don't dictate, council doesn't dictate what they do or how they use that space at a very prescriptive level. Obviously, we've said, here it is, it's a space that you can use. Please run with it and do what you think the Wellington community needs. And I'm sure they'll try different things. There'll be different artists, there'll be local artists, there'll be artists from out of town. This particular artist today is from Kamilaroi country rather than from Wiradjuri country.
Yeah.
But again, it's about just energising and activating that whole space there. And you've got a coffee shop there, and that's a good way to bring people together as well.
Yeah, it certainly is. Now, moving on to the next thing, we've had some announcements coming, I think coming very soon, if it hasn't already, about the award of grants from the Community Services Fund for organisations in both Wellington and Dubbo, which is really good to see. And of course, Binjang's been a recipient of this too. I have to admit. So that's really good to see. And people need to know that these funds are out there and readily accessible if you're in a community organisation.
They're really, from the council point of view too, it really is money well spent, because the multiplier the council gets from putting that $5,000 to a community organisation often comes back, 2 or 3 times that. So it really is a very good expenditure of money.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of these organisations rely so heavily on volunteers, exactly as Richard said.
Yeah.
They'll take a small amount of money from council, and then we look at what they do with that small amount of money and we say, wow, that's fantastic. You couldn't do that with a paid organisation, you couldn't do that with council money, but when we give it to these community groups to help them along the way, they really do some great things with it. So the $60,000 we've given out in one group there of different amounts, and I don't expect you to go through all those individual recipients. No. That went through council last night, so officially that was resolved by council to hand over those monies. We haven't actually done it yet, but it's okay to talk about it, and it's now official, it's now resolved by council, so it will happen. We'll just have to organise a day to actually hand over those cheques to those organisations, and I like hearing from those organisations about all the things they're going to do with that money, and I sit back and say that is fantastic use of that money.
Yeah, sure. I should mention there's actually 2 funds there. There was the Community Services Fund, and also there was the Financial Assistance Fund Round 1, of which we were able to get some money out of, which was great. I'd like to just move on next to the next topic, which is the licence agreement for 74 Winjawara Street. Excuse me, I'm not from Dubbo. Winjawara Street. To do with a playing field, I believe, called the Greens, and it's to do with the rugby club. So what was that all about?
So this is a space that we've got at council at the moment that we've got to work out what we're going to do with it. So there's a building there. It used to be a bowling club many years ago. It had greens there for the bowling club. Council ended up in possession of this particular parcel of land and the actual building there, but there's no plan there. There was no previous plan as to what to do with it. So we've got to go through a planning process, work out the best use of that particular site, work out how to get some funding, work out some sort of budget for it all. That all takes time. In the meantime, there's a building and some space that's sitting there not being utilised. So the idea here is that we're asking for organisations to give us an idea of what they would like to do with it, an expression of interest to tell us what they would like to do with it, with a very important proviso: the maximum amount of time that any organisation will be able to have that will be 2 years, because we figure that at that sort of time frame, around 2 years, we'll have some use for that. We'll have some grander picture, some larger scheme, that we won't necessarily want to have someone that's in a lease there that we can't get them out of. So anyone that's got an idea, it's a short-term public exhibition process, because we want to find out in a pretty quick period of time what people want to do. So if you've got an idea, come forward by the 7th of December, by close of business on the 7th of December, that's Wednesday the 7th of December, and you don't need to put a huge amount of detail in. Tell us what you want to do with it and how much you're prepared to pay, because we do expect some organisations to pay for that. So tell us what you want to do, how much you want to pay for it, send it into council, and then council will consider all those at our meeting on the 8th of December, and then a decision will be made as to who might have access to that for those 2 years.
Okay. Now, of course, when you do these council meetings, the main council meetings, you consider all the reports of the subcommittees that happened 2 weeks before.
Correct.
So one of those reports that came forward was from the Villagers Committee meeting, and that was on the 9th of November. So was there anything Richard would like to say about that?
Yes, Tony, I'm actually chair of that committee, and it was the second such Villagers Committee. The first one we held at Stewarttown. And to be quite honest, perhaps it was the first meeting, and we didn't really achieve that much in the first meeting, except set the agenda for subsequent meetings. And the second meeting we had, as you say, was earlier this month. It was at the Wellington Council Chambers building here, and I thought it was excellent. It was just really a lot of the members of the committee. We had some in person and some by teams, coming in by teams contact, and some of the ideas that came from the Ballymores and the Elongs and the Stewarttowns, the Gearys, were really very good. And I think that just that sense, more than anything probably too, just the sense of them being part of the community, of their voice being listened to, was probably the thing that really came through most of all.
Yeah, perspectives that you would not have thought about necessarily at all.
One of the things, for instance, that we did talk about, and we certainly haven't resolved it, but one of the things we did talk about is trying to get some of the members of those villages, communities, to actually do some work around those villages that would perhaps normally have been done by council. I'm talking about mowing or some of the maintenance tasks. And for instance, Ballymore does have a council-provided lawnmower, and there's some designated people who can use that, and they go out, and if you go through Ballymore, it really does look neat and tidy, and it's terrific. So that sort of concept, can we just broaden that out a bit to other villages and communities?
Well, Stewarttown has one too.
Yes, yeah. And look, there are problems because of insurance, and I think one of the problems was that they were saying at Ballymore they're allowed to mow some areas but not others, because they've got to cross the road to get to that other area. So look, yes, there are issues that have got to be resolved, but I think if we look at that and say how can we resolve it, and how can we broaden that concept out, it would really be beneficial for the communities and obviously council.
Yeah, okay. Now also there was a report of the Public Spaces Tree Committee. I'm interested to see what progress is being made there. I know that very often they'll get requests to remove trees and all this sort of thing, just the general maintenance side of things, but what I'm interested more is in the planning part of it, particularly as I know there's an update on the Wellington Street tree master plan. I'd love to know what's happening with that.
Yes, that I think that's probably one of the more important committees in the Dubbo Regional Council, because it really is fundamental to our community. I have not terribly much history involvement with it, but I gather it is a little bit fractious, and I gather there are quite, as you'd understand and expect, some pretty diverse opinions. But I think that committee really should provide a vehicle to try to bring together the views of the community and to end up with a really workable Trees Committee strategy.
Yeah, okay.
I think an important part of that too, Tony, is that you do realise when you're getting involved in, say, tree plantings, for example, just the modern methods that we've got now. So the Stockholm method, for example, is a method that council typically uses when they do tree plantings. And if you think about some of the old trees that you see around, you'll often see lumps on the road, or it lifts some of the concrete underneath the footpath. So it becomes an area where people say, I don't like a tree there because it creates all these issues, or some elderly people that might want to go on the footpath, it makes it hard for them to get along if you've got these big lumps there. So modern tree planting methods, for example, the Stockholm method, is a way to try and both direct roots down deeper, but also channel some water along so it actually still gets the right amount of water. So there's modern tree planting methods that help with this, and there's some of the things that are discussed at things like a public spaces tree committee, so we might wonder what the discussion is about. And there's a whole range of things that are discussed, but it really is about making the entire environment that we all live in better, and that involves, yes, having more trees, which everyone agrees is going to be better, but having trees in a way that doesn't damage other parts of the infrastructure, because obviously they can do damage to sewerage or underwater pipes, and so you want to try and plant those trees in a way that it does minimal damage to the infrastructure while still having a good tree canopy.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, having the suitability of trees considered as well for the environment that we're in. And in relation to that as well, there's some trees which are quite suitable and some that are certainly not. There's other issues. Some trees attract certain birds, for example, cause problems there, or can do. There's all sorts of issues that need to be looked at. And there used to be, I know in Dubbo, a master plan where they had the areas split up into zones, and they had species that of preferred plantings in those zones, and they allowed residents, I believe, to plant certain things in those zones. I'm not sure if it was on the council land or not. They might have had...
No, it would have been on their private land, but it was more encouraging. Here are the type of trees that might be more suitable and more amenable to the area that you're in.
Yes.
But again, and there's a lot of experience there with our staff and council, and obviously it's not just the regional council. There are councils across the state, there are councils across the nation. We can learn from various things, and how do you refine the type of plants you use. So there's all that experience that goes into it. So when you see a staff member say we're going to plant a certain type of tree in a certain area, it wasn't just on a whim, it wasn't just saw one yesterday on special, so I thought I'd buy a few. There's a fair bit of planning that goes behind that.
The other thing that's really coming to the fore, I think, is a bit of a change in what's happening in the community. Before, people liked to fairly, if they bought a block of land and built a house on it, they liked quite a big block of land. Now the evidence is, in the last 3 or 4 years, that a lot of people don't want a backyard. You know, they really they don't want a big area where they've got to maintain. And as soon as you say that, they don't want a tree in the backyard. And so, whereas in 100 houses you may have had 90 backyards with trees in them, now you're not getting that. So I think there's a shift there that council has to come away from just relying on relying on private residents, and more the public has to become involved.
Yeah, that's a very important point. And the other thing about all of this is streetscape and the appearance. And this was the other thing about the plan that Dubbo had going back in the day, which I think is still on foot, by the way. But you know, this brings into play the next big issue that we have, and it's what a lot of research has gone into in looking at the environmental aspects of tree planting and how that can cool suburbs down if you do it the right way. And it's more concentrated these days on roadway spaces or next to it, verges or whatever, or in the middle of the roads where there's a verge, if you can call it that, or an island. And if it's done in the right way, with proper streetscaping by architects, it can actually be a really big benefit.
The prime example of that is Macquarie Street in Dubbo. I mean, that used to be very ordinary, and I think back in Jennifer Locke's day, when I think she was Deputy Mayor of Dubbo City Council at the time, pushed for that whole streetscape beautification of Macquarie Street. It's absolutely turned it into a fantastic thoroughfare.
It has.
And you know, that's the sort of thing that you want on every main street.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree with that.
And the interesting part is I remember well when that was all happening there, and there were severe complaints. I wasn't on council, of course, going back a long time ago, but the severe complaints because there might have been 3 parking spots lost from one particular block.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there are always those competing interests, and
Sure.
our job as
Yeah.
councillors is to make sure
Yeah.
we're looking at all those different competing interests and coming up with what we think is the best long-term vision for the community. And sometimes it might mean that some people might lose some car parking spots because we'll get a better outcome overall for the community. So they're always interesting discussions that you have
Yeah.
with people when they've got those various competing interests.
Yeah, it's all about clever integrated planning in the finish.
Mm.
And then after that, maintenance. I've seen trees planted in car parks, and that was a part of their DA. And 5 years later, there's half of them there, and then 5 years after that, there's none.
Yeah.
And no one says, well, there's supposed to be trees there. And the car park is, in the meantime, a really hot space in summertime, and it looks dreadful.
And those developers that were involved in that initial DA, and they would have had some conditions of consent and might have had, as you say, a certain number of trees to be planted. 5 years later, 10 years later, that developer's long gone,
Yeah.
so then it's left to the tenants or the people who own those particular properties there. So it does make it a bit more complicated, but you're right, that's one thing that council certainly can keep an eye on.
Yeah, that's what happened at the car park between our supermarkets. That's exactly what happened. Anyway, we're kind of running out of time here now, fellas. There's so much to talk about.
There is.
And that's the problem with having 2 people here. You see, you
Yeah,
get
well-
twice as much input.
Yes. Well, I think we can probably avoid the talk about potholes in the Bell River, because I think we've done a fair bit of that already, and we're sort of waiting on outcomes from the state government anyway in relation to a lot of it. We know the work goes on, and it's a difficult task, and it needs a lot more money and a lot more planning for the future rather than the patch-up maintenance regime that we currently have around rural roads.
Particularly with the Bell River, I think that we do need an overall planning strategy for the Bell River, not just for the infrastructure that's been damaged.
Yeah, that's true.
So while you're on that, Tony, if I may mention the next Community Leaders Breakfast, as you know, we have those in Dubbo and Wellington on a regular basis. And when you mention the state government and waiting for the state government to maybe hand some money out for some roads, well, the next Community Leaders Breakfast is on this Saturday with in Dubbo, that one. So we've got Mark Colton, our federal member, Dougal Saunders, our state member, and of course councillors there and some of our senior council staff. So that'll be a fantastic event. And then the next one, we're trying to plan the next one for Wellington at the beginning of February. So we're just trying to line up calendars of Andrew G, who's obviously your federal member here, and Dougal Saunders as well as councillors, to try and get the next one in Wellington early February.
Okay, and I think the next ordinary meeting of council is in Wellington, isn't it?
No, that's the next, in February the next one is in, but we've got one more to happen for this year in December. But from memory, Richard, the one early February is in Wellington.
Well, the early, I think the scheduled date was the day, 25th, I think, the 26th of January, which was Australia Day. So we obviously couldn't have it then, so it's been put off to a fortnight later, into early February.
And that will be in Wellington, but we've got one more for the year, and we've brought that forward again with Christmas. So the 8th of December is the last meeting for the year. That one is in Dubbo. No meeting in January, as Richard said. It was going to be Australia Day, but that obviously wasn't going to work from a perspective of getting everyone together on that day. So it's been pushed into early February, and they'll be back in Wellington.
Yes, this time around we'll publicise it so it doesn't turn into a secret meeting in Dubbo.
That'd be good. That'd be good. I do like to see people in the gallery coming on and watching.
They'll come if they know. If they know, they'll come.
Yeah, a lot of people watch online though too. Don't forget. So that's something that's certainly quite gratifying when people do sit there and they do take notice and do care about what's happening on council.
Okay. Well, thanks for coming in today, fellows. We've had the Mayor of Dubbo Regional Council, Matthew Dickerson, and the Deputy Mayor, Richard Ivey, on our little, I would say, sort of fireside chat really today. Which is a bit of a departure from what some of the others
The cut and thrust of a...
Yes.
That's very good.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate your time and binging as always.
That's always a pleasure. You're listening to Binjang 91.5, and it's back to all the great music and information on Binjang.